It's a very cold night in London. It's currently January, it's the beginning of January, and I just wanted to be in my pajamas, have a little conversation about this book. It's Things I Don't Want to Know by Deborah Levy. Deborah wrote 3 books over the course of 8 years that she refers to as her living autobiography. This is the first book in the series, and the series is actually quite popular. I feel like I've seen the books pop up on my Instagram feed, on Pinterest boards. I haven't read the other 2, so I don't really know what they are about. One of them is called The Cost of Living, and the third one I forget, but I'm gonna put them up here on the screen. But this first one was written back in 2013, and it talks about kind of gender politics. It talks about the identity of a person when you feel like you don't really belong to one place. Out of all the authors I've ever read, if I had to reference one writer that Deborah's writing reminded me of, it would definitely be Rachel Cusk, because they have a very fluid way of writing. And this one is supposed to be a response, I guess, to an essay written by George Orwell called Why I Write. And I haven't read that, so this conversation is just going to be me talking about my interpretation of this book and what I kind of got from it. My puppy wanted to join in, so he's here now. This is Taro. Hello. It's okay, you can chill here with me. Down? Good boy. I first read this book in May of 2024, and then I went back and I reread a couple of the parts because I just wanted to refresh my memory for this review. But when I went back and read it, I actually enjoyed it a lot more, and it gave me the impression that this is the kind of book that you can keep coming back to many times in your life if you want to. And it's actually quite short. The print is also pretty big, so it's not going to take you a very long time. It's kind of one of those books that you don't have to be in a headspace. You can kind of pick it up at any point in your life and you can come away from it with a very different meaning. The book starts off in London, and Deborah talks about how this was a time in her life where she felt like she had a lot going on, and she found her life to be quite suffocating. To quote her, she said she was at war with her lot, and she found herself crying a lot on train stations and escalators. And when I think about London Underground and just how depressing it can be, I'm not surprised. But I just recently realized that I do really love reading about books that are set in London, because it just gives me a very different perspective on London, which is necessary for someone like me who I feel like I have a love-hate relationship. Over the summer, I'm like, I love this city, and then over the winter, I literally cannot leave the house because it's so depressing. But yeah, that's why I feel like multiple parts of this book was also very relatable for me. At this point, she decides that it's really too much and it's getting out of hand, so she decides to head to Mallorca, and we don't really know why she chose this place or what's the point in this. All we know is that this is where she wants to escape to right now. She decides to go to Spain because she's feeling very lost in London, but the moment she arrives in Spain, she gets lost, literally. And she takes a taxi from the airport and she's headed to some kind of cabin in the mountains when the taxi driver, he seems a bit out of it, to be honest, but basically drops her off in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. And she seems to have not a big reaction to this, more like, yeah, I was lost and now I'm literally lost. So she finds this random rock under a tree, sits down and starts smoking a cigarette. She was trying to quit back in London, but now at the airport she bought another pack, so she's very much intending to get into it. It's just one of those moments in our lives where I think a lot of people can relate. You try to get rid of habits, and then something happens in your life and you see yourself going back to those old habits, just like a comfort thing, like a pacifying. You need something to pacify you, and I think that's what was going on in her mind. But eventually the owner of the place where she's supposed to be staying comes and finds her sitting there and smoking, so she leads her back to the cabin. And this is where we find out that it's not Deborah's first time in this particular cabin. It's more like a B&B for multiple guests, and it's owned by this one lady called Maria. And I feel like Maria is very important in some ways to this whole book and this whole story without really being like a prominent character in it. So I'd keep that in mind. So it's Maria, it's her place, and Maria, like, she takes care of everything. She's the one who's put the place together. She's the one who's growing all these fruits and that she serves in breakfast, making the bread and chopping the wood and lighting the fire. She's just managing this whole place by herself. She was actually here a long time ago in her early 20s, and being here now, I felt like it was interesting that when she was here in the early 20s, she was very much in love with someone, and it was the summer and she had a really beautiful time there. She was trying to call her lover from the place, so she has this incredible feeling of like, I'm here for a brief period of time, but I'm going back, and I'm going back to love, and there's so much to look forward to when you're headed back. But in this case, she's come in the midst of winter, which I personally didn't know that Mallorca gets that cold in winter. But and then she's now here in winter and she doesn't really have anything to look forward to when she's back. So it's like a very different feeling, but the place itself has stayed exactly the same. And I think this is like something that makes her realize this even more, that the place where she was once many years ago has stayed the same, and it's beautiful and she loves so much about it. But when she thinks of herself and how much she's changed in the time since then, I think it kind of makes her even sadder. There's a little quote on page 9, and it says, "When happiness is happening, it feels as if nothing else has happened before it." And I think this is the sensation that she probably felt when she was younger. She was so happy in that moment. She thought that that feeling would last forever. And I think a lot of times when we are very young, we don't really think about how quickly that moment can pass and how quickly life can change. But for her, it was coming back here was more of a reminder that, you know, things do change a lot over time, and whatever you have in the moment, you know, we shouldn't take that for granted. And I think this is where she is right now with her lot, that she feels very much like she had a lot going for her, and right now she feels very lost, both in herself and in her writing. And I think both are interrelated, definitely, and this is something that she'll be trying to figure out over the course of this book. She heads to her room, and it seems like this really quiet place. And as she is a writer, I feel like a lot of writers do like to escape to these places where I feel like there is space to think. So she starts unpacking, and she finds this notebook that she had actually taken with her on another trip to Poland many years ago. But she seems to have brought that same notebook with her on this trip, and it takes her back to her time in Poland when she had met this actress. I've written in my notes her name. Let me see if I can find it. Zofia Kalinska. I actually have not looked up who she is or what she's acted in, but that's the actress. There was a lot of interesting stuff in this part where she remembers like her time interviewing this actress, Zofia. But the part that I found particularly interesting was when she was talking about the actress was in an interview with Deborah, and the actress was talking about the expression of emotion. And obviously she was referring to it in terms of the world of acting, but I actually think that it rang very true of Polish society in general. I have a little quote for you from this part that I hope will give you a better idea. "The form must never be bigger than the content, especially in Poland. This is to do with our history, suppression, the Germans, the Russians. We feel ashamed because we have so much emotion. We must use emotion carefully in the theater. We must not imitate emotion. In my productions, which have been described as surreal, there is no such thing as surreal emotion. At the same time, we are not making psychological theater. We are not imitating reality. To speak up is not about speaking louder. It is about feeling entitled to voice a wish. We always hesitate when we wish for something. In my theater, I like to show the hesitation and not conceal it. A hesitation is not the same as a pause. It is an attempt to defeat the wish." I don't know if she wrote it word for word or she just wrote it in her own words, but the words are beautiful. The next morning when she's having breakfast, and Maria brings her like a really beautiful fresh plate of like bread and things that she's made in her own garden. She just starts thinking about Maria, and the two women seem to not really have exchanged much about their lives, or like Maria doesn't know much about Deborah's life in London, and Deborah's also kind of like not that inquisitive, I guess, about Maria's life, but she does know a few things, and she shares that Maria is actually one of the few women in this very Catholic village in Spain who chose not to marry and not to have children. And I think we always think about these things in terms of present day, but we have to remind ourselves that it's very different when you live in a city or you have grown up in a liberal-ish country, and it's very different when you are surrounded by people who think very differently to you. So it's a very, very bold move to choose yourself and to stick by that, even when, you know, you're at that stage in your life where people around you might make you feel incredibly lonely. But on the other hand, I think looking at Maria made Deborah think about her own experience as a mother, and how, you know, when she was really young, and she kind of looked at herself as almost metamorphosizing into motherhood instead of motherhood being just a part of her life. I see a lot of discourse online where people criticize mothers and they call it like toxic parenting or toxic motherhood, when a child wants to break free and they want to have their own life independent of their moms, but the mom doesn't quite want that. She wants that child to still depend on her. And I think this is like, I understand the criticism, but I also think that it's equally natural for women to feel like that, because if you really think about it, society does really ask you to strip away all your identities till motherhood is the only identity that you're left with, because there's so much in and around motherhood that there is expected out of a woman at this stage. I'm not saying that that type of feeling is correct. I'm just saying that if women are really made to feel like they cease to exist if they're not needed by their children, there is some kind of problem in how we are making mothers feel as they're trying to do this incredibly difficult job of raising a human being. And how Deborah labels it as you almost become like this political prisoner, because you become at odds with what you think motherhood is and what kind of mother you want to be and what the world expects out of you as a mother. If this is a topic that is interesting to you, I feel like this book is so rich in how it talks about it, but I will read some passages out to you. As I bit into the sweet orange flesh of the apricot, I found myself thinking about some of the women, the mothers who had waited with me in the school playground while I collected our children. Now that we were mothers, we were all shadows of our former selves, chased by the women we used to be before we had children. We didn't really know what to do with her, this fierce, independent young woman who followed us about, shouting and pointing the finger while we wheeled our buggies in the English rain. We tried to answer her back, but we did not have the language to explain that we were not women whom had merely acquired some children. We had metamorphosized, new heavy bodies, milk in our breasts, hormonally programmed to run to our babies when they cried, into something we didn't entirely understand. We too had all sorts of wild imaginings about what mothers should be, and were cursed with the desire to not be disappointing. Like everything that involves love, our children made us happy beyond measure, and unhappy too, but never as miserable as the 21st century neo-patriarchy made us feel. It required us to be passive but ambitious, maternal but erotically energetic, self-sacrificing but fulfilled. We were to be strong modern women while being subjected to all kinds of humiliations, both economic and domestic. I think this section made me the most emotional. Obviously, I'll come to the second part, which I found even more intriguing. But at the time when I read it the first time, I was like, really, my mind was blown. But when I read it the second time, I think I felt sad, and just rang true to me how true it is. Later that day, she goes out for a walk and she finds herself sort of on the beach or pier, I don't know, she's somewhere near the water, and she's trying to think about what it is that she's doing here, which is so relatable, because I remember I was once in Spain, sorry, slight segue. This was back in 2019, and I was working for this company. I actually really loved my job. Okay, I'll start there. I loved the job. I was not a big fan of the company and the culture, mostly because at the time I didn't realize how little they cared for me. I had come out of school and I just felt like, not school, university, and I just had a lot more faith in human beings. But I think it was a very good lesson. But I remember I was in Spain for one of the projects, and I was having a really terrible day, and I walked to the cliffs, like where you could see the sea, and I just sat there and I was like really drifting off into thoughts about like, what the hell am I doing and where am I supposed to go from here. And I remember feeling so incredibly lost. But even though it didn't give me any answers, the sea just made me feel so calm and so incredible. And it made me think about how like I always love the sight, the smell, everything about the sea. And it's always been a dream of mine to live somewhere near the sea. Maybe one day. Anyways, had nothing to do with this book, but when she was talking about this, it just reminded me of that if I'm ever sad, like, I want to go see the sea. Later that evening, she goes to one of the few restaurants that's open. I think it's the only, this is like major off season in Mallorca. So she's gone into this restaurant on a very cold night, and she sees that there are some tourists, so it's not entirely empty. But the waitress is refusing to give her a table for 3 when she's just one person. And so she pretends not to understand Spanish, and she also pretends not to understand English, and she just kind of wants in that moment to be left alone. So she sits on this table, and at the same time she sees that the local shopkeeper, who is actually a man from Shanghai, he sat at the bar, so he comes and joins her, and they make a little joke about how she almost got kicked out if he had not come and joined her. So he sits down and they start sharing a bottle of wine. And at some point he asks her if she's a writer, and it's like such a rhetorical question because why would anyone ask someone that unless they know that they're a writer? And also she's seen him read one of her books because he's always like reading behind the counter in his shop, so she knows that he knows. But I think both him and herself, they're both asking something else by asking that question. Is she still a writer? What is she writing about currently? There's just so many questions she has currently about herself and writing, and I think him asking this just made her feel all of those questions a lot more deeply. When he asks her this, I think it finally makes her realize, as she's trying to answer this question, just how much she's been struggling with this question, and also the question of whether she's the writer or the subject. And I think it's so hard to pull yourself away from the subject of what you're writing. And I think that's where she feels like so much of her is in the writing, and maybe that's why she's been struggling to write, because right now whatever she is not something that she's completely at peace with. He knew I was a writer, so I wondered what it was that he actually wanted to know. I sensed he was asking me something else. I think I had been asking myself something else too, because I was still no closer to figuring out why I had been crying on escalators. Instead of giving him like a straightforward answer, which she's not entirely sure if he wanted one, she talks about where she grew up. She grew up in Johannesburg in South Africa, and then she came back to London at some point. So she starts talking about her childhood, her teenage, and the next 2 parts of this book are those 2 sections of her life: her time in South Africa and then her time in London growing up. And I think it's just 2 very vivid snippets of her life that define very much why she chose to write. And I think this is where the attempt to respond to George Orwell comes from, because she talks about these many people in her life, these many encounters and experiences, and women, most importantly women in her life, who encouraged her to want to write. And what I feel like she does is basically say that why men write and why women write are 2 very different things. And this is just her talking about why women write, and that's her response. And through these stories, she paints a picture of why women write. And I think she's done that so beautifully, especially like I'm trying to remember memories of when you were such a young child is so hard. I really applaud her for at least being very up and honest about her time in South Africa, because I'm sure it was not easy to write this. We are then taken back to her childhood. It's 1964 in South Africa. This is in the midst of apartheid South Africa, and there's this one evening that she takes us back to when she's making a snowman with her father, and it's very vivid. And I think one of the reasons is that it's snowing, which is not very common in South Africa, and secondly, her dad got arrested that same evening. He got arrested because he was part of the African National Congress, which had been banned by the government at the time for fighting for human rights. I do have a bone to pick with my history curriculum in school, because we were taught so much about world history. I feel like whenever I'm with a group of people, like I'm always one of those people who are so proud of how much of the world history I was taught growing up, and I just love knowing about at least the histories of people and where they come from. But South Africa was just left out. Like, I don't remember a single thing. So I'm currently trying to read. I haven't made a very good attempt, to be honest, but I don't want to educate myself more because it's so recent and it's so, like, it's part of so many people's history. So it's very important, I feel, to read that. But at the same time, I was really feeling rather lost in some. I had to keep going and looking up like what's happening. But I'm glad, because I never picked up this book thinking, oh, let me learn something about South Africa in 1960s. But that's what it made me do. And this is why I love books, because it can take you to places where you don't know you're going. Back to the book, the two people that she remembers very fondly from this time is her nanny, Maria, and her daughter Thwandi, who she used to call Doreen. I'm guessing she was given a name that didn't sound, I don't know, as Deborah puts it, to quote her, so that the whites can say her name. Just listening about her memories about Maria and Doreen, you can really tell that her parents, like you can probably tell that from her dad being part of the National Congress and being arrested, but they didn't treat Maria like she was their help or anything like that. She was very much part of the family, and both Doreen, can I call her Thwandi? I don't know if I'm saying that right, but I like the name a lot more. Thwandi, the little girl, and Deborah, they used to even have baths together in the same bathtub. But obviously the fondness that the family had for Maria and Thwandi was not really public. This is something that they very much kept within themselves. This part of her life, I think it was in a way really sad, but also a little bit inspiring, because as such a young girl, she showed so much strength, because she remembers that she just wanted to kind of turn into Barbie. I think that's what she talks. She wanted to be plastic, because with everything happening around her, Barbie seemed to be so untouched by everything and still perfect. And I think that was her first kind of like muse. Like, she's like, oh, I want to be her first idol, like her first what do you call it, like inspiration in life. And from then on, she talks about how she became very meek and she became very, very quiet, and she was disappointed by a lot of people in her life who were supposed to be taking care of her. So she doesn't really remember this time with fondness at all, but she remembers not really having a space to like talk about how she was how all of that made her feel. And I think this is something that we often are at fault as adults. We forget that children, even though they look small and they're still growing up, and they might forget a lot of things once they're adults, but like when they're feeling those things as kids, it makes them feel a certain way, and that feeling stays forever. And I feel like the thoughts that they have and the struggles that they have, if they don't have an outlet to talk about it, that struggle to voice and talk about your feelings stays with you for the rest of your life. If you're not someone who is very good at articulating or is encouraged to talk about what you're experiencing as a child, I do think that it becomes more of a struggle when you're an adult. That's just my personal opinion, but I think this is what she's talking about, that there are so many times in her childhood where she wanted to voice herself, but she was just in so many situations where no one was really listening to her, that it made her feel like her voice was shunned. I think for her mother at the time, it was probably becoming a lot to take care of Deborah, and also all the other things going on in her life. So Deborah briefly was sent to live with her godmother, called Dory, not Doreen, Dory. And Dory had a budgie called Billy Boy. So it was like this little bird in a cage. And I think this bird kind of reminded Deborah of her own dad, and she didn't know it at the time. But this, watching this little creature, so innocent, so cute, being locked up in a cage, she probably associated it with how her dad might have been feeling, being locked up and away from his family and away from freedom. That one day she wakes up and decides to let this bird free. But to her surprise, the bird doesn't really want to go anywhere, because this bird has never been free and doesn't really know where to go and what to do. Dory is very disappointed with her, so she is again sent back. But in the time that she stays with Dory, someone who makes a huge impression on her is Dory's daughter, who is a teenager, I believe, and she is Melissa. And she seems to be one of the few people in Deborah's life who really encouraged her to be more expressive in herself. I watched Melissa make herself up in odd, humble silence. The idea that plastic people were the most interesting people was born first of all in Barbie's painted on blue eyes, then in Maria's painted on brown eyes every time I asked her about Thwandi, and finally in Melissa's teenage laboratory. Melissa was quite literally making herself up. The fact that lipstick and mascara and eyeshadow were called makeup thrilled me. Everywhere in the world there were made up people, and most of them were women. Then she encounters her first act of rebellion, where she sees Melissa in a relationship with someone from a different community, which was not really allowed at the time. She has a boyfriend called Ajay. If this was love, it was forbidden love. Even I knew that. Everyone in the cafe knew that. Politics had found its way into grapefruits and into holding hands. And I thought that was such a nice memory and snippet to put into that, because again, as we're growing up, if we don't really see people fight for what they love or stand up for what they feel is right, and some certain acts of rebellion also teach you that you also have the right to form your own questions about what you think is right and wrong, and you shouldn't just accept things as they are. And that left such an impression on her, and probably made her think many times in life about whether, or question many things about her own life that she had taken for granted up until that point. The last two sections, Sheer Egoism, which is in England in 1974, which is her time when she's back from South Africa, and the very last section, which is back in Spain in conversation with the man at the restaurant, are both very, very short. But I think it wraps up the story really well, because in the UK, when she's back, this is like the humorous part of the book, because like I said, I have never related to anything more. We're now in 1975 in West Finchley, England, which is actually not that far from where I live. I find the way that she describes England far too relatable to be comfortable with, because I don't want to be that pessimistic, but it is winter right now and I totally feel what she's feeling. She was 15 at the time, and she was already aspiring to be a writer, like the poets and philosophers who drank espresso in French cafes while they wrote about how unhappy they were. This is her words. Her parents had actually separated by the time, and she was living with her mother, who had progressively become more and more messy over time. And she kept thinking about, why are all the lids to everything always off? Like nothing, no jar has a lid. And she tried to think about, like, was it always like this? Did our house always not have things with lids on them? And everything was just messy. Everything was on the floor. And that morning that she's taking us back to, it's a day when there is a jar of honey sitting on top of a washing machine, and somehow that jar falls into the washing machine, and a swarm of bees that are right outside the window come and enter the washing machine. And somehow it's her job to clean that up, because her mother can't do it and her brother is not the one expected to do it. So there she is, trying to clean that mess up, when she gets bitten on her hand and it gets all warm and swollen. And all she wants to do is get out of there. She's so done, and she's just desperately wants to leave the house when her mom reminds her that it's also her job to clean the oven. I tried to stare at her blankly, but my eyes began to hurt. The effort it took to look cool and unfazed by everything was exhausting me. I walked down the stairs, tripping over my denim flares, banged the front door with my smarting right hand, which was hot and red from the bee stings, and attempted to run in my new lime green platform shoes. As I passed the Chinese takeaway called Holly and the dry cleaners called Rubens, a pensioner dragging her beige plastic trolley in zigzags across the pavement said, "I like your funny hat." It was very urgent that I got out of my life. Inside the greasy spoons, steamed out windows, and haze of cigarette smoke, this sense of urgency accelerated. I had so little time. Time for what? I didn't know. But I was convinced that there was another sort of life waiting for me. This part, you get to this very like sticky, gross, uncomfortable sensation you feel from her words where you're like, I totally get it. You really want to get out of here. But first, that feeling was just restricted to her house, where she's like, I don't want to be here. My mom's always telling me things to do, and she doesn't really care that I've got bee stings all over my hand. Now she wants me to do something else, second job, as she calls it. But the moment she leaves her house, that feeling outside doesn't really disappear. She feels like she needs to get out of the UK altogether. As she goes on, we come to realize that she's really struggling with the parents' separation. I don't know if she clearly describes if they've had a divorce, but they're clearly not living together anymore. And she's still very young, and it felt like all those happy memories of being together in South Africa with her dad and mom. And, you know, although there were many things that had happened in South Africa that were not really happy memories, somehow things didn't really get better when she moved to the UK, and I think that's what made her really so frustrated. Love between mom and dad had gone wrong in England. Sam knew and I knew, but there was nothing we could do about it. When love goes wrong, instead of seeing the front of things, we saw the back of things. Our parents always walking away from each other, making a separate lonely space even when they sat together at the family table, both of them staring into the middle distance. When love goes wrong, everything goes wrong. I think those pages where she talked about her relationship with her mother were a very brave retelling of what it is like to live with a parent that is still struggling to accept what's happened to them, let alone be able to look after themselves and their child, who is becoming a human. Really, your brain is still forming. Although you're semi-adult, is still so much that you struggle with at that age, and I think this was a very honest and brave retelling of that time in her life. She also talks about how this time in England really had so many questions for her about where she grew up, because part of her is, yes, she is British, but she relates so little to this place. She remembers the smell of plants she doesn't even know the names of, and places, and you know, where she grew up was so incredibly different to where she is now, which she's supposed to be from this country. She's supposed to be British and relate to British people and, you know, find all of this madness her home, but she can't quite call it that because she didn't really experience it. She doesn't have a formal nostalgia for the place that others might. We then come back to the restaurant in Spain, and they're still talking, and at this point in the conversation, Maria storms into the restaurant. Maria, the owner of the hotel, cabin, whatever you want to call it, lady, and she seems to be carrying a suitcase with her. And I missed a little part. That morning, she was actually having an argument with her brother, and she was crying, and it seemed like she was going through her own things. So right now, when she rushes in with her suitcase to, she comes up to Deborah and she said, "Oh, I heard that you were cold. Here's a key. I've put you in a different room. It's smaller, but it should be cozier." And Deborah is really appreciative, but at the same time, she's like, "Oh, you're going away." So she pays her in cash for the days that she's staying there, and Maria seems to be really happy, and she just walks out of there. And it's sort of like so many people are going through so much at the same time, and we sometimes get lost in our own sauce and our own things, and we don't realize that. But as Maria walks away, Deborah does too, and this man walks her back to the place where she's staying. They say goodbye, they have a little kiss, doesn't really mean anything. Anyway, he gives her his jacket, and then she goes back to her room where she sees the fire is burning and the room is warm, and Maria's left her many blankets, and she just feels so grateful in that moment. And I think it comes as a realization to her then that she's been waiting far too long for clarity to come to her on what it is that she should be writing and how is it that she is feeling. She wants some answers, and she's come to this place for answers, but we don't really get that, and that shouldn't stop us from starting to do something. If she wants to write, maybe that process of writing will help her make sense of everything and get to an answer eventually. But it's not always going to be the case that we get clarity about things. Like sometimes we start projects and our mind is still a mess, but as we start putting things on paper and as we start working on it, only then things start to take shape and they make sense. And sometimes we go back to the drawing board, but it's almost like a dance where you go back and forth, and then you come to some form of conclusion. And I think that was really like where the book left me, thinking about how many times I've delayed things or put things aside because I feel like, oh, I need to have a better, more rounded picture of what I want to do and how I want to do it. I want a clear, like a vision, and I want to know exactly how to tackle this. And then I eventually put it away for such a long time that I'm not even, like, I've lost the motivation to do it altogether. But instead, if you just start somewhere and you can scrap that, and maybe you learn something in the process about what it is that you actually want to do. So it's all a process of learning and just getting started. So that's it. That's things I don't want to know. I haven't read the reviews on this. I don't know if this is people's favorite book in the trilogy or their least favorite. But I will say that the more times that I read it, the more I liked it. And this is just my introduction. I really loved reading her autobiography as one of the first ones, because I think now that I read her books, I will have more of an understanding of her as a person. I have some books on my list that I want to read after this. I have Hot Milk, and I have, what's the other one? Black Vodka, which is a collection of short stories. I thought that would be a great introduction to her fiction, and we can just take it from there. I hope you enjoyed me talking about this book. If you know who Deborah Levy is, let me know what your thoughts are. Do you agree, disagree? How do you feel about her writing? What did this book make you think about, or how did it make you feel? And if you have never heard about her, I hope that maybe it encouraged you to look into it. But yeah, I will see you hopefully soon in my next book video. Okay, Tara, I think I got that. I think I did it. I think Mama finally filmed the video.